Welcome to Lesson 1, the Course Introduction. As with a number of Oracle courses, at the beginning there's a little bit of talk discussing the class and our overall course objectives for the class. So first up, we have a little agenda. So we're going to go through this agenda briefly. We'll just mention it now, and then we'll go through the details as we go through the lesson. We have course objectives, what we'd like you to learn at the end of the course, what we'd like you to take away and understand about SQL tuning in the Oracle environment for developers. We have a course outline that just shows you our suggested order of doing the lessons and whereabouts they fit into the schedule. We'll talk briefly about prerequisites for the class, and we'll talk about different activities to help you with the learning process as we go through and share some exciting information about SQL tuning. So when you complete this class, what we'd like you to do is be able to choose an appropriate SQL tuning approach. We're going to look at a tuning mechanism and a methodology that Oracle has developed over almost 40 years of having the Oracle database, and has evolved to a certain extent out of operating system tuning. For the operating system, evolved into a database tuning methodology. We also want you, when you need to do a tuning exercise, we need to go and have a look at detailed information about how your SQL is running in particular sessions. So we want you to be able to gather the suspected session statistics using the SQL trace facility and interpret the very basic trace information that SQL trace provides. By doing this, we can poorly performing SQL statements. And once we've identified the poorly performing SQL statements, we can use some basic tuning techniques to tune the inefficient SQL. SQL isn't performing as well as we might like. As part of this process, we're going to have you look at execution plans. So we're going to need to explain how you can interpret execution plans for the SQL statements running on your Oracle database. And as we work through this course, we're going to share a great deal of information about the Oracle Optimizer. A great part of this course is understanding how the optimizer makes decisions and what decisions it makes around picking execution plans for your SQL statements. So to aid this process, so you understand how it works, we want you to be able to explain the various phases of optimization as you go through this class. And we're going to have a number of lessons coming up on that. Control the behavior of the optimizer. There are a number of ways of influencing its decisions. We want you to understand which access paths the optimizer uses as it's accessing the data, how it joins two or more tables together, and other SQL operations that it does as part of processing an SQL statement. We want you to be able to list the optimizer's statistics, best practices for collecting statistics on the objects within the database, your tables and your indexes, and how the optimizers make use of this information for you. And then finally, we want you to be able to manage your performance of your SQL through changes. Changes can cause poor SQL plans to be picked by the optimizer, and we want to review and make sure that you can control that behavior, ensure after you either upgrade to a new version or change something else within your environment, your SQL continues to run at the best available performance. Now, who's this class intended to in our prerequisites? Well, we intend this for people who are Oracle SQL developers. They have experience with SQL and can write SQL statements. It's not a class on writing SQL, though a part of this class will address some aspects that influences how you write the statement, influences how the optimizer makes decisions. So there is some aspect of making sure you write things that gives the optimizer the best approach, but to a great extent is about understanding how the optimizer works and how we can influence the optimizer, and also confirm that it's making the best choices for us. So we assume a good working knowledge of SQL. There are other classes that provide that, such as the introduction to SQL statements. And we also expect you to have some experience writing SQL on the Oracle database, understand the Oracle database environment a little bit. Next up is a little outline. This was intended to be a 3-day class. So we have broke it up into a sample layout for the 3 days. This varies slightly when I teach it in the classroom and how we're teaching it. But on day 1, we're going to complete this introduction to this class. We want to have a look at the introduction to SQL tuning at a high level. Then we want to have a look at some tools that we can collect SQL tracing information to delve into a little more details on how the SQL is being executed. And then we need to understand how to interpret the information in this area. And then we'll also have a look at some very basic tuning techniques that we can employ without knowing a great deal about the optimizer. And then we're going to explore the optimizer in greater detail later on. So we'll start with an overview of the optimizer fundamentals. Okay, at the end of day 1, day 2, we'll have a look at generating display and execution plans. There are many ways of doing that. And then we need to understand how to interpret the SQL. What information is it providing to us? And then we'll have a look at the details of how the optimizer actually works within the particular environment. We're going to explore the table and index access methods as the first lesson, where we're exploring a little more details of the optimizer. Then we'll have a lesson on joining the SQL operations, on doing join statements. Then we'll have a look at other optimizers. So we're just exploring the optimizer, how it makes decisions, and what is it doing for us. On day 3, we'll have a look at collecting statistics on the objects within the database and for the database overall that we know as optimizer statistics, and have a look at some basic concepts. And then we'll discuss bind variables. We're going to see bind variables earlier on in a couple of chapters. We're going to explore a little more details around this area in this chapter. And then we'll get into some of the a new feature in 11G that will help us manage the SQL execution plans over change, called SQL Plan Management. And we continue this process in 12C of the database. And then we have a workshop that we will have a look at the details of reviewing the information that you work hard on this class. To a great extent, the workshop reviews the information, but in a slightly less structured manner that you did in the practices earlier on. Because there was lots of information we wanted to share, there were a number of areas that we don't get into details on the main course, but we put in as appendix to give you some additional follow-up information. If you're not used to SQL Developer, there's a little introduction in the first appendice to let you have a look at SQL Developer in a little more details. We use it as a tool within the class to do some of the practices. Within SQL Developer today, we've updated SQL Developer so you can now run the SQL Tuning Advisor. And we mentioned that when we are doing the practices, but if you're interested in having more information about how the SQL Tuning Advisor works, I would invite you to have a look at this class. There is also a component that isn't integrated in SQL Developer today, but if you have access to Enterprise Manager, you can use SQL Access Advisor that only looks at individual indexes as an access path, which is really what the SQL Tuning Advisor, one of the aspects the Tuning Advisor looks at. It also looks at, should we do partitioning or should we use materialized views as also mechanisms of increasing the performance of some SQL statements. Then also your SQL statements are running on the Oracle database. We do talk about in a couple of lessons a little bit about the Oracle architecture, the way it impacts the Oracle statement. But my belief is the more you know about the database architecture and the environment your SQL statements are running in, the more you know about the environment and the more confident you will be and the better decisions you can make around the SQL tuning process. We also have a little chapter on real-time database monitoring, which was another new feature we added to 11G of the database, and it continues on and being expanded in 12C. It can be important for you if you are working with systems that have long-running SQL that are fundamentally batch-orientated or reporting systems as opposed to pure OLTP systems and that. And then finally, we have the details of gathering the statistics and managing the optimizer statistics. I really view it as a DBA role, and you're going to hear the DBA word every now and again during this class, even though it's intended for developers. So we put it in just in case you're working on your own database and you need to gather on your own test database. It's good to have the information. So once again, you're invited to look at any of this material in the e-kit at your own leisure, at your own time. There are 3 groups of activities that we have set up to help you with the learning process beyond the lecture portion. One is we have quiz that will test your knowledge of the important concepts in each chapter. And when I introduce a quiz, I'll give you a short period to contemplate the answer, perhaps pick the answer. You, of course, can always get it from the e-kit, but I like you to actually do them, think about them. It allows you to review and think about the material a little bit. We have also practices for a number of the lessons that allows you to go in and review what we've talked about and get some hands-on experience with it. And at the end, we have workshops that allows you to extend your hands-on experience in a slightly less structured form. Okay, normally this slide we would do in a classroom where we'd have members of the class introduce each other. Since you won't be doing that in a TOD, we'll just skip over it. Okay, in the course we use a group of sample schemas, okay, that come with a standard database. If you choose when you install the database to pick the sample schemas, and it just gives us a standard set of tables we can use for the SQL practices. And the tables we're using, some of them are the tables from the sales history schema, or lovingly called SH schema, the human resources schema, okay, and the order entry schema. The human resources schema, as we'll see on the next slide, is a pure relational schema. On the other hand, the sales history is actually a data mart schema that uses a star schema as its optimization technique. And the order entry is a little more, is a relational schema with a little more complex objects on it. And then we have the infamous Scott Tiger account that we also use, has been around traditionally in the database as one of the sample schemas for a long time. It was the original sample schema, and we also occasionally make use with that. I'll just give you a little heads up. We actually create a schema during the course in a script file to do some of the demos with. This is the first look at the human resources schema out there. It's a pure relational schema. This is a representation of an entity relationship diagram for the schema. And the main table, or the main entity, if you're into entity relationship diagrams, is the employees. And we have a number of attributes for the employees. These get naturally translated into tables and column names after somebody has done the database design, done the 3 normal form normalization process, and comes up with the entities, and then we can drive them into the table definitions. And quite often on a table we find a repeating group. On the table we could have stored the department name, the managers of the department, okay, the location of the department, but we have a number of employees that work in a particular department, so we did a 3rd normal form normalization process. When we found a repeating group, such as the department name, department manager, and department location, we took it out and made it a separate entity, which translates into a separate table. We have a foreign key relationship between the employees table and the department. That's what these little diagrams with the dashed lines and what some people call chicken feet at the bottom. When they're sitting on top, they look like if you sketched a little chicken, it looks like a little chicken. Okay, so we've done a 3rd normal form, and the department number was normalized out into a separate table. We also discovered departments can have many locations around the world if it's a big company, and locations can exist in many countries, in the United States, in Canada, in England, etc. And the countries can be in can have different regions within them. So they've just done a normalization process on it. And we use this table for a great extent to do simple queries. Unfortunately, the tables in here have very limited number of rows, so when we actually want to look at a significant amount of data, we could actually have a look at the sales history. Queries get a little more interesting and a little more interesting to tune when we have more data. So the sales history is a little data mart, and our fact table for our data mart is the sales table. It's made up of a whole bunch of keys that connect the fact table to a number of dimensions tables, the times table, the cost tables, the channel table. It actually goes on to the next page where we have the products and the customers and the country table also. And in the fact table, we have a group of keys that there's a link, and then we have some basic information. We have the quantity sold and the amount sold. Most of the details is stored in the dimension tables. And to give us a little bit of data, we've got just under 1 million rows in the sales table. So it gives us a little more realistic data to query in our application. So we're going to be using these schemas as part of the class. Okay, these schemas are stored in accounts within the Oracle database. So we're going to be using the accounts that represent these schemas. So the accounts we'll be using within our Oracle database that we pre-installed for you is the SH schema, the HR schema, the Scott, and the employees. And in our setup for the basic schemas, we picked very bad passwords. Of course, don't do what we do in the classes. Do what we recommend, pick better passwords, but it's convenient for the classes to put accounts that Trevor can remember, okay, during the class. Okay, so we keep them pretty simple. They're actually the same as the ID. Password for SH is just SH, etc. On each of the machines that we do the demonstrations on, and optionally you acquire the practice environments the same way you got in this class. We have a standalone install of Oracle. It's actually installed on Oracle Linux. We have 12c database installed, the Enterprise Edition. We like to show you in the classes all of the features. And we have the sample schemas installed, and we'll be using a subset of them. And there are a number of ways that you can run SQL against your database. You can run it from an application, but that was a little more complex than we want to do in the classroom. We use some basic tools to provide the environment. So the ones that are provided in the classroom, you can use our old friend SQL Plus as a basic command line tool. We can use SQL Developer as a GUI environment. It's a free tool that you can download. It also now comes with the database, gets installed with the 11G and 12C databases these days. And if you have access to it, you can use Enterprise Manager Cloud Control also. In a lot of organizations, cloud control is really limited to DBAs. In reality, they could open up for developers. In my experience, that very rarely occurs, even though you should ask them for it, in my humble opinion. Okay, we also have some workshops, demos, and some code to have a look at while we're looking at the practices. I'll be using the demos, the workshops, the code examples. I don't look at that much. We may have a quick look at them afterwards. We just wanted to explain when we were looking at the environment that we're going to be using to demo on for this course, where things were. There's a labs directory. We're just using the little file system explorer that Linux, the Oracle Linux comes with. And under there, we have a subdirectory for the code that says some example code that can be looked at. We have the demos that we use very extensively in lesson 4. We have a little bit of setup. The way they originally set this up, we don't do anything with it. They just have it out there. And we have the solutions for a number of the practices. There were very long SQLs. Some of them get a little longer. We didn't want you to have to type it. We provide them in script files to make it a little easier. And then we have the same thing for the workshops that we'll be using while we demo the workshop environment. And of course, we mentioned the appendices that gives you additional information on SQL Developer, SQL Tuning Advisor, the Access Advisor, the database architecture, the real-time database monitoring functionality for running SQL, things that take minutes or hours as opposed to OLTP, statements we actually expect to execute in a second or less, and then finally a little more details on the mechanics of gathering the statistics. There are additional resources available for you to consult, okay? There are a number of examples and areas that will be interesting on the Oracle Learning Library that's implemented as an Apex application, and you can access it off of the Oracle Technical Network, which you can also access the Oracle Technical Network off of www.oracle.com. And they give you a URL in the manual to have a look at. Unfortunately, sometimes they move things around, so I won't guarantee the URLs will work infinitely into the future. They do work now because we've tested them. Okay. There is also information about the Oracle Cloud and deploying applications and databases on the Oracle Cloud, so we have a URL on that. And there is a very interesting blog under the Oracle blogs, okay, around the optimizer and having a look at the details of the optimizer. And of course, Oracle Technical Network is the source of interesting technical information about the Oracle products, including the Oracle database.